Bible study at Second Baptist. I'm glad you could join me today. We're continuing in our study of Luke, and it certainly is cold in here this morning. I had already gone over to spring. I had counted those few days as being spring, and I had forgotten all about winter already, and now it came back, and so I'm having to get used to winter all over again now that we're having second winter. So I hope you're staying warm, and I hope that some of you have been able to go ahead and get your vaccination for the virus already, and I've not, but hopefully in our community we can quickly be able to get it for anyone that wants to have it. We're going to continue today in our study in the book of Luke, studying about Jesus and the beginnings of his ministry and some of the things that he was doing. And so our book takes us then to chapter 5, and the focus verses that the book has is verses 17 to 19. But I'm going to begin at verse 12, and I'm going to go all the way down through that little section, because this was a section that was in between the calling of Peter and James and John. When he went last week, as we talked about it, he saw them in their boat, and then he called them and said, "Follow me, and from now on you'll be catching men." And then after this section was written, Luke talks about the calling of Levi or Matthew. And so in between those two then comes this section. And if you look back in Matthew, Mark, and John, the other three Gospels, you'll see the story that we're going to talk about today in a couple of those. In one of them it's very abbreviated, and then in the other one it might be even a little longer than this, have a couple sentences more. So each author was writing as God gave them inspiration to write, and recording the things that Jesus was doing or had done. And they don't all record it in exactly the same way, because each individual may have seen it themselves, or in the case of Luke, if he did not see it himself, he talked with a lot of people who were first-hand witnesses to the things that Jesus did. And so each version is recorded just a little bit differently. But if you read them all together, then you begin to get the full story. And the same thing with the miracles of Jesus. If you were able to take all the miracles of Jesus, you'll see some that are repeated in all four Gospels. But then there are others that maybe it only appears in one of the Gospels and not the other three. And so that doesn't mean that that person made it up. That just means that they were all recording the things that God led them to record, and they couldn't possibly, I think John said it somewhere, we could not possibly write down all the things that Jesus did if we had the rest of our lives to be able to write down all the things that he said and did. And obviously that's true. I mean, they could not possibly write down everything they saw, and it was probably overwhelming, really, to think about so many things, and how do you pick and choose what you would write down, as they went through. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to read the first little section, and then we'll talk about it. So I'm in Luke chapter 5, and like I said, the first 11 verses was where he was calling out Simon and James and John. And so I'm going to read from verse 12 down to 16. While he was in one of the cities, behold, there was a man covered with leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and implored him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy left him. And Jesus ordered him to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest and make an offering for your cleansing, just as Moses commanded, as a testimony to them. But the news about him was spreading even farther, and large crowds were gathering to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus himself would often slip away to the wilderness and pray. So there are a few things about this miracle of healing that Jesus did. The man had leprosy, and in the Old Testament, it's very clear about the rules about leprosy. It describes in great detail, this is in Leviticus, and I'm going to read you a little part of it, but it describes in great detail what is leprosy, what does it look like, what it doesn't look like, what they were to do, isolate the person for 7 days and keep watching it and see if it goes away, and if it doesn't, on and on. And you can read that if you care to read, all of those rules about leprosy. But it also gives the rules about what a leper is to do, and that was what I wanted to read to you in Leviticus chapter 13. And so right before this verse, it's talking about the leprosy and how to identify the leprosy. So you get down to chapter 13 and verse 45. So he's been determined to have leprosy, and he has been declared to be unclean by the priest. And so then it says, as for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, and the hair of his head shall be uncovered. And let me see, there's another translation of that, or disheveled, so messed up. And he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. And he shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. So it was very specific about what the leper was supposed to do. He's supposed to wear raggedy clothing, and his hair, in my version it says his head shall be uncovered, but then another meaning for that it gives is that his hair, is all messed up. It says he shall cover his mustache. I'm not sure if they mean he should wear a veil on his face. I'm not sure what that means. And then he should go around crying out, unclean, unclean. And he has to live outside the camp and remain there all the time, living alone outside the camp. And so he's isolated from everyone else and doesn't hopefully pass along the leprosy to other people. And his appearance in that description is going to make it so that if a person sees him and he's like that, they can immediately know, there's a leper, I should stay away. And so it was a terrible disease for a person to get, you can imagine, because of all of that right there, not to mention what leprosy actually does to a person, which is very bad. When we first went to Nigeria, there were lepers. Now they have medicines for leprosy, and you don't really see a lot of people with leprosy. But when we first went back in 1991, there were there were lepers, and in one of the places that we would always see them was in front of the grocery store that we went to. It was a little shop called Lantana's, and in there you could buy some American type foods, and then also just your regular groceries. And they would sit right outside because they knew that the missionaries would be going in there, and other Americans that lived in town, or British or whatever, and that they would give them money when they came by, coins or whatever. And so they were beggars, and we would see them and greet them and give them money for their livelihood. But in this case, with the Israelites, they were commanded to live outside the camp. And down in southern Nigeria, near the hospital, they did have a leper colony where people lived in. They had set up a village for the lepers, and the lepers would go there and live together with other lepers, and that was the place, because it is a contagious disease, though not extremely contagious. But if you have a low immune system, then it is a contagious disease. So this leper then, who was really not supposed to be, I don't think, coming up to Jesus, but maybe Jesus was walking outside of town or along the road, when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged him, or implored him, it says, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." So he knew something about Jesus already, and he knew that Jesus had been healing people, and he knew that this was maybe his only hope of getting rid of this terrible leprosy that he had. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, which was very much a no-no. If you were to touch a leper, then you would be considered to be unclean for the rest of the day, and the things that you were supposed to do to make yourself clean again. Jesus crossed that barrier and touched the leper and said, "I am willing to make you clean and be cleansed." And then immediately he was cleansed, and the leprosy was gone. So I think Jesus saw his sincere belief that Jesus could heal him of the leprosy, and Jesus did heal him. And then Jesus said, "Go show yourself to the priest." And there is a whole section there in Leviticus where I was reading that tells what you do when you're cleansed. You go to the priest, you take an offering, the priest does this, that, the other, and it's very specific. And so this is what Jesus was saying. This is, follow the rules of Moses that were passed down. Go and show yourself to the priest and make your offering for your cleansing, and this will be a testimony to the priest that Jesus had healed him. And so and it says Jesus ordered him to tell no one. But can you imagine if you had something terrible like that, like leprosy, and you had been isolated from everyone, and suddenly this man came along who touched you and healed you in an instant, just like that? Would you keep that to yourself? I don't think so. You would be eager to tell someone, and then the one you told would be eager to tell others, because that is something miraculous and not the normal way that things happened. And so, so the news spread about him far and wide because of this and other things that he was doing, and large crowds were beginning to gather. And of course, then it says in verse 16, Jesus would often slip away to the wilderness and pray. So Jesus was doing these things daily with large crowds gathered around him, that would be exhausting to have that all day long. And then he would take times then that he would slip away so that he could be alone and pray and rejuvenate himself, I'm sure, and talk to the Father about the things that were happening. So that kind of leads us up then to the beginning of our lesson for today. And we'll go ahead then and follow along with the book in verse 17. I'm going to read that verse. One day he was teaching, and there were some Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting there, who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was present for him to perform healing. Now there's a couple of things in this verse. If you look back in, let's see, I think it's in Mark, in one of the other Gospels where it refers to this same time, it gives a little more detail about the fact that it was in a house that he was doing this teaching, and it was so crowded that you couldn't even get in the door. So there were so many people in there, they were just, packed like sardines. And so that, it doesn't exactly go into that depth of explanation here in Luke, but it does in one of the other Gospels. And the other thing that I would like to discuss about this is where it says the power of the Lord was present for him to perform healing. In your student book it says, and the Lord's power to heal was in him. Okay, so the other Gospels that record this story do not sort of mention that phrase. And so we have to think about, was it that it almost sounds like, okay, the power came on Jesus and then he began to heal people or something like that. But really, would that be correct? That would not be correct, because Jesus could have healed anyone at any time, anywhere he was. He did not have to have power come upon him and suddenly he would be able to heal, and then maybe it would go away and he couldn't. It wasn't like that. But I think, to interpret this verse, we might remember where Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country, and how he did not do as many miracles in certain places as others because of people's unbelief. Something like that. And I think, it may be something like that, where Jesus' power to heal was free to work, I guess you might say, to be able to heal people, because they were believing that he could heal them, and paying attention to the things that he was saying. So that's kind of the way that I take that part of it. And I tried looking it up, to see if there was a different interpretation or meaning in there with the original Greek. And no, it's just basically that, I think. So let's go on then and read verse 18. And some men were carrying on a bed a man who was paralyzed, and they were trying to bring him in and to set him down in front of Jesus, or in front of him. But not finding any way to bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and let him down through the tiles with his stretcher into the middle of the crowd in front of Jesus. So Luke gets more detailed on this part, saying, the man was paralyzed, and that, sounds like something that Luke would have been interested in knowing what was the origin of his infirmity, or what was the nature of his infirmity. And so these men were carrying this man on a bed, it says, but it also, I think in some places it says a pallet. In your student book it says a stretcher. So they were carrying him, probably one on each corner, and tried to come in the door, and there just was no way. People would not let them pass. Other people were probably there who also had illnesses or diseases, and maybe they also, wanted to get the chance to go in front of Jesus and be healed. And so that may have also been a part of them preventing these guys from bringing bringing the paralyzed man in, because, they were having their turn, or they were, up there hoping to have a turn. And so they went up on the roof, and, in those houses back in the day, it says that a lot of times they had stairs that went up on the roof, because they would go up there, and maybe there was a flat portion of the roof or a patio-like thing up there that they could sleep up there at night when it was the really hot season and be cooler. And so they went up there, and then they removed tiles from the roof to make a hole to be able to lower this guy down through the roof. Those would possibly have been clay tiles that were, stacked to make a roof. And if that were the case, if they didn't have anything else plastered over them or whatever, then they can just be lifted off. But then if they had other plaster over them, I guess they would have had to break that plaster and really make a hole, and take the tiles out. At any rate, they made themselves a hole to put this guy down, their friend, down in front of Jesus. And then let's see how Jesus responds. Now, this had to make a racket with all the tiles being removed and things like that. I feel like unless the tiles were completely free and not plastered, then it would have had to make a racket and draw attention to the fact that they were opening up the roof. But that's another part of the story that we don't know anything about. And so let's read verses 20 and 21. Seeing their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven you." The scribes and the Pharisees began to reason, saying, "Who is this man who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" So Jesus sees the man and sees his repentant heart and says to him, "Your sins are forgiven." Because Jesus can see our heart, and he knew that that was a part of why this man had come to Jesus. And the scribes and Pharisees are sitting there, and they get all bent out of shape about this, because Jesus had said his sins are forgiven. And they viewed Jesus as just being a man, and apparently they were interested in him because they had come and were sitting there listening to him, but they did not view him as being God who could forgive sins. They just viewed him as a man. And so, they began immediately, and you can imagine if we came to church on Sunday, let's say, and the pastor stood up and said, "You know what? Don't worry about God anymore. I'm going to start forgiving your sins for you." And that would kind of be the way that this came across to the Pharisees and the scribes, because to them, he was just a man. And then for him to say this, to make this statement, challenged them. Maybe by now they should have figured out that he was the Messiah. Maybe they didn't want to believe that he was, and that was a part of the problem. But at any rate, this was their reaction, was to say that he was blaspheming. He was saying something that brought shame onto the name of God, you might say, a blasphemy. And so then in verses 22 to 24, Jesus' reaction. But Jesus, aware of their reasonings, answered and said to them, Why are you reasoning in your hearts? Which is easier, to say your sins have been forgiven you, or to say get up and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, I say to you, get up, pick up your stretcher, and go home. So, what Jesus said there, which is easier, to say your sins have been forgiven you, or get up and walk? And truly, someone might say, oh, your sins are forgiven. And you don't, if it's a person, obviously, you would not know necessarily if your sins had been forgiven or not, but they could say that and there's no proof one way or the other. But for him to say, get up and walk, then that is a statement that can easily be demonstrated or not. So the power of him saying that is immediately seen in the fact that the paralyzed man gets up, takes his stretcher, and walks. And so what, this was a visible sign that Jesus was giving them by saying, which is easier, to say that sins are forgiven, or to say get up and walk, and we can think about it that way. Now, a part of this that we need to not skip over is Jesus was aware of what they were saying. Now, did he hear them, or is it just because Jesus knows our hearts? And that's what I think it is, because how in a crowded room like that with so many people, they would have been murmuring. They would not have just been standing up and shouting that out to each other. And so, but Jesus perceived what they were saying in their hearts or to each other about him forgiving the sins. And then he made his response. So they didn't have to come right out and even challenge him or say that to him, because he already knew what they had said. And that's important for us to understand the nature of Jesus, the characteristics of Jesus. So this is one of the things, that he could see the heart of an individual. Just like with the leper, he could see that that man sincerely wanted to be healed, and he healed him. Here he can see the judgmental attitude, I guess you might say, of the Pharisees and the scribes, and he can tell what they're thinking. And so he tells the man, get up and take up your stretcher and go home, or your bed. And then in verses 25 and 26, immediately he got up before them and picked up what he had been lying on and went home, glorifying God. They were all struck with astonishment and began glorifying God. And they were filled with fear, saying, we have seen remarkable things today. So the man gets up. The paralyzed man is no longer paralyzed. He gets up. He has strength to stand. Not only that, to pick up this bed, pallet, stretcher, whatever it was that he had been lying on. The ways parted. He didn't climb back out the roof. The ways parted, and they were able to let him go back out, even though they weren't able to let him come in. And he went home glorifying God. So he was praising God that this thing had happened to him. It was wonderful. Not only that he was healed, but his sins were forgiven. And everyone there was struck with awe and wonder and saying, we have seen incredible things. Now, even the scribes and Pharisees had to be astonished that this had happened, because they saw the man paralyzed and then this miracle take place right in front of their eyes. They had to have been struck with awe because of this. But what they did with it then, there was probably a different reaction for different people that were present at the time, where some may have become jealous of Jesus' power. Others may have said it was fake, it was false, somehow it was a trick. But then there were others, and many, who believed and knew that he was doing miraculous things. And so I think to me the biggest takeaway of this lesson, besides the fact that Jesus had the power to forgive sin, which was a power that only rested with God, and this shows us that Jesus was God. When Jesus said, I and the Father are one. Jesus was God. He had the power to forgive a man's sin. But also, the other takeaway that I always want to remember and remind myself of is that Jesus can see straight to the heart of a person. He knows not only what you say or what you do, but why you said or did it. He knows your thoughts and the intents of your heart. And when we view a person, we try to take them at face value a lot of times, or we base it on the things that we've seen that they've done, but we really don't know deep down inside what that person is thinking or what their motivation might be. But Jesus does, and he can see right into our hearts. And so it's really important for us as believers and others who may not be believers to understand that we need to not only make our face right with Jesus in showing up at church or being clean on the outside and sparkling when we do show up or whatever, but we need to make our heart sparkling on the inside, because Jesus can see right straight into it and know our attitudes and our thoughts and feelings and what is really in there. So that's my takeaway for this lesson today. And I hope that you will continue to think about what I mentioned last week about trying to figure out a way that you can get more connected to people in the community, or what one thing could you do today that could help to touch someone's heart and to make their heart soft towards Jesus, to make them turn their heart towards Jesus. You have a great week, and I'll see you next time.